Zunächst möchte ich den Organisatoren
present this paper and for accepting it for publication in the journal Historical Judgement. The talk as well as the paper is based on a chapter from my book, The Nazi Study of India and Indian Anti-Colonialism, which has been published by Oxford University Press in 2024. Yeah, I never miss a chance for self-promotion. So historians who are actually much better than me have already written on the history of the Indian Legion. So in my book, I have tried to view the Legion as an instrument of Nazi political and military propaganda and as a target of different kinds of racism. Nonetheless, I think I have to begin with a brief history of the Legion. Around the time of the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, a number of non-German legions were incorporated into the Wehrmacht, apparently as volunteer troops. The Indian Legion was one such unit. The Indian Legion was known officially as the Indian Infantry Legion 950 and unofficially as the Tiger Legion, since the soldiers of this legion wore, in addition to the Wehrmacht uniform, a specially designed badge on the right arm depicting a leaping tiger. The recruitment and training of the legion, comprising volunteers from the Indian prisoners of war, or POWs, who had fought the Axis forces in Africa as a part of the British Imperial Army. India was, of course, a colony of the British, started in Germany in 1941. Efforts to form an Indian Legion received an impetus after the Indian anti-colonialist leader Subhash Chandra Bose, 1897 to 1945, arrived in Berlin as a political refugee in April 1941. Bose sought Nazi Germany's support to free India militarily. Hence, he suggested to the German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop that an Indian army should be formed from the ranks of the Indian POWs. This suggestion corresponded well with existing German plans. By the beginning of 1943, the Legion came to comprise around 3,500 soldiers. In May 1943, they were deployed near the North Sea coast in Holland. However, the cold and rainy weather there appeared to dampen the spirits of the soldiers. Moreover, and this was the more important reason, the German army staff began to suspect that the Indian soldiers became much too friendly with the locals, particularly the women. Similar troubles, within quotes, had occurred in Germany. So the Indian soldiers were supposed to exert a kind of exotic charm for the German women. Such relationships threatened to disrupt the so-called racial purity of the Volksgemeinschaft, or national community, as envisioned by the Nazi regime. Therefore, in September 1943, the Legion was transferred to the south of France, lovely area, where it was given the task of patrolling a part of the coastline. The Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944 forced the Legion to retreat towards Germany. During this retreat, it became involved in violent clashes with the Maquisards, the French resistance fighters. In September 1944, like all the other foreign units of the Wehrmacht, the Legion was incorporated into the Waffen-SS. By December 1944, the Legion was stationed in Heuberg in southern Germany, where it remained till its official disbandment in May 1945 by the American Army. The Indian soldiers were turned over to the British, the colonial masters, and subsequently sent back to India. Some German officers and soldiers were handed over to the French and put on trial. The rest were tried in Germany under Allied jurisdiction. This well-known history needs to be placed within its proper political context. The idea of an Indian Legion was directed by political rather than military considerations. Hitler considered Indians to be an inferior race that deserved to be ruled by the British. However, After Ribbentrop became foreign minister in 1938 and war with the British Empire appeared increasingly likely, German propaganda aimed at India began to strategically encourage the Indian anti-colonial movement that was then in full swing. The German goal was to make things difficult for the British. The notion of raising an Indian armed unit to fight the British as part of the Wehrmacht was an extension of this propaganda strategy, with which Subhash Chandra Bose's agenda fitted in well. Raising an army from the Indian POWs was a joint venture of the German Foreign Ministry, the Wehrmacht, and the Free India Center, or the FIC, which Bose was allowed to set up in Berlin with local Indian civilians, many of whom were anti-colonialists. In order to associate the Indian Legion with Bose's anti-colonialist agenda, the Indian soldiers of the Legion wore on their armbands the symbol of a leaping tiger, which we see here, chosen by Bose for the FIC. However, despite the attempts made by Bose and others, only a small number of POWs could be persuaded to join the Legion. This was because most Indian POWs in Germany were ordinary soldiers for whom freedom from colonial rule was an abstract notion. As in the case of other military units, the Wehrmacht intended to exercise full control over the Indian Legion. The way to achieve this was through political propaganda glorifying the achievements of Nazi Germany and its Führer, as well as by indoctrinating their soldiers into the Nazi worldview. For example, it would be propagated that Hitler used to play these bloody games as a child, and he came back to his mother looking all bloody because he fought and won wars against his enemies in the playground. That kind of things were propagated. The command of the Legion was given to Major Kurt Krappe, a pro-Nazi military officer who had lived in Tanganyika, Africa, for a long time and supposedly had experience in dealing with colonials. This colonial aspect was not a coincidence. Colonialist thinking, carrying the imprint of the British imperialist outlook, was prevalent among the German military personnel, along with the biological racism popularized by the Nazis within the Wehrmacht. Racial prejudices led the Germans to refer to the Indians as bimbos, and the Legion's predominant language, Hindustani, as bimbostani among themselves. This racist approach was also reflected in a handout written for the German officers by the adjutant Ulrich von Kritter. In the handout, apart from other things, Kritter also complained that the German women were so shameless that they were kind of throwing themselves at these brown-bodied exotic Oriental men. Kritter's handout claimed that Indians were primitive in certain respects, which made them susceptible to pedagogical influence. For Kritter, the ideal medium for influencing the soldiers was the Legion's magazine Bhai Band, which literally means brotherhood, and which was translated into German as Kamerad or comrade. This magazine was published at frequent but irregular intervals from mid-1943 to the beginning of 1945. It remains one of the most tangible manifestations of the German attitude towards the Indian soldiers, who remain largely voiceless. Bhaiband was written by hand in two Indian languages, Urdu and Hindi, and printed at a press in Bordeaux. Though it claimed to be written by Indian soldiers, the pamphlet was actually composed by a number of German scholars specializing in India and/or the Islamic Orient, who acted as interpreters in the Indian Legion. Mediation between the Wehrmacht and the Indian soldiers required specialized knowledge of Indian languages and customs, since the Legion comprised Indian soldiers from diverse regional, linguistic, and religious backgrounds. Such knowledge could be provided only by experts on India. Interpretation or Dolmetschen was a politicized function in Nazi Germany. The regime expected interpreters to be politically reliable agents who would, along with translating languages, propagate the greatness of the Reich. Ernst Bannert, the chief interpreter of the Legion, as well as the other scholar interpreters who composed Weihband, Eugene Rose, Paul Thieme, and Karl Hoffmann, were well equipped to meet this political demand. An examination of Weihband points to its role as a weapon of Nazi propaganda. It disseminated the Führer cult among the Indian soldiers by eulogizing Hitler in the guise of informing the soldiers about German history. I gave you an example earlier, Hitler's childhood and so on. These stories were published in Weihband. Anti-Bolshevism, another prominent component of the Nazi Weltanschauung, was propagated in Weihband in different ways. For example, through a series of vitriolic articles carrying the neutral title, "What is Bolshevism?" The pamphlet was also used to reinforce the authority of the Legion's commander, Kurt Krappe, often by invoking the name of Bose, who had left for East Asia in February 1943. One such write-up claimed that it was Krappe who decided to start the Legion. This was, of course, a blatant lie. The same text went on to mention the deep friendship that supposedly existed between Krappe and Bose, another blatant lie. It ended with the cry of "Long live Hitler and long live Netaji." The word Netaji, meaning respected leader in Hindi, referred to the honorary title given to Bose by the Indians in Germany. This dual salutation reflected the oath of allegiance that the Indian soldiers took to carry out Bose's fight for the freedom of India by accepting Adolf Hitler, the supreme leader of the German state, as their commander-in-chief. This principle of dual loyalty was also promoted by the propaganda unit of the Wehrmacht through articles in the German press about the common destiny of the German soldiers of the Wehrmacht and the soldiers of the Indian National Army in Europe. Now, the name Indian National Army actually refers to a much bigger force that Bose could form in Japan, where he went, in East Asia, where he went. And this much bigger East Asian Indian National Army fought together with the Japanese forces against the British, but it was routed in the Battle of Kohima in 1944 by the British commander, by the British Imperial Forces under Commander Claude Auchinleck. Both seem to have concurred with the German plans regarding the Indian Legion. In November 1943, Weihband published a missive from Bose stating that he now officially placed the Indian National Army in Europe under German command. This message formally sanctioned the Wehrmacht's complete control over the Indian Legion. Apart from Hitler, Weihband repeatedly mentioned Field Marshal Rommel, whose name was familiar to most Indian soldiers from their time in Africa. Rommel had inspected the Indian Legion after the Allied landing in Normandy in 1944. At that time, the Wehrmacht's propaganda unit, PK, had photographed Rommel with Indian soldiers near the Atlantic Wall in order to reassure the domestic population that they were being protected. Rommel's name was subsequently cited in Weihband more than once. For example, to proclaim that the necessary task of the Legion, now in retreat from France to Germany, was to fight the rebels or the Maquisards. Castigating the Maquisards as communal terrorists was a part of the training provided by the Wehrmacht to its interpreters. Presumably, the interpreters of the Indian Legion had also undergone this training. Weihband also deployed knowledge of India's history and culture to inspire loyalty and fighting spirit. This was the distinctive contribution of the India experts. Popular patriotic songs and poems in Indian languages were quoted, and there were often references to anti-colonialist Indian leaders, including Gandhi and Bose. Actually, Gandhi and Bose had fallen out. Their policies were different and they had political problems. But German propaganda simply ignored that and pretended that Gandhi and Bose were together. So this propaganda was used to motivate the soldiers to fight a war that actually had little to do with India's independence. The different traditions of the three religious communities represented in the legion, Sikhism, Hinduism, and Islam, were also called upon. The Sikhs were found to be particularly irritating by the scholar interpreters, and the Sikhs were also the most notable. It's not a coincidence that the Sikhs are being photographed by Rommel. They were particularly exotic. They looked, with their tall and relatively fair skin, they looked a bit European, and the women were most attracted to the Sikhs. And they dominated the army because the British considered the Sikhs to be martial races. So British Indian Army was dominated by Sikhs. In the British Indian Army, every Indian regiment consisted of battalions formed on the basis of religion, region, or ethnicity. The language of command was English. Following his political vision, Bose insisted that Hindustani should be the language of command. Every unit of the Indian Legion was to incorporate men from diverse religious, linguistic, and regional backgrounds. A pan-Indian identity was to replace sectarian ones. Ernst Bannert, the chief interpreter of the Indian Legion, as well as Eugene Rose, another interpreter who wrote an autofictional account of his time with the Legion after the war, claimed later that Bose's vision of a non-segregated Indian Legion resulted in the marginalization of religion and moral depravity of the soldiers. Depraved acts included the consumption of alcohol even by Muslims and visits to brothels, activities that were regularly engaged in by the German soldiers. So there was a separate brothel set up for the Indian soldiers with women from Eastern Europe because German women and French women were considered to be much too Aryan for the Indians. For Bannert and Rose, a non-religious Oriental was not an authentic Oriental. There were series of articles specifically targeted to the Sikhs where they were told that they needed to retain their religion, they needed to keep wearing the turban and not drink alcohol and not shave off their beards. They needed to remain true to their tradition. The Indian Legion, which was conceived primarily as a tool of Nazi propaganda, was thus subjected to different forms of racism that intersected the Nazi worldview, colonialist attitudes, and Orientalist scholarship. Thank you for your attention.